The air in the great market of Oak Haven was thick with the stench of despair and unwashed bodies. It clung to Lysandra's thin tunic, a shroud of filth she couldn't escape. She stood on the raised wooden block, a piece of property waiting to be claimed, her bare feet cold against the rough-hewn planks. A number had been chalked onto the back of her hand. 17. Her uncle Drelven, his face flushed with cheap ale and greed, stood beside the auctioneer, avoiding her gaze. He had called her a burden for the last time that morning. A mute omega. Useless. Defective. The words had been blades, but she had not flinched. She had not made a sound since the day her parents were slain, the day she had whispered a vow over their cooling bodies, a promise sealed in blood and ancient magic, a vow of silence. Her voice was a treasure locked in a cage of her own making, the key thrown into a river of grief. To speak before the appointed time would be to lose everything, to betray the last legacy of her line. So she remained silent. She endured. The auctioneer, Varric, a man with a voice like gravel grinding stone, bellowed her description to the leering crowd. A rare beauty, this one, though flawed. Silent as the grave, but strong-backed and young. Perfect for hard labor or a quiet bed warmer. Laughter, raw and cruel, rippled through the assembled merchants and landowners. Lysandra kept her eyes fixed on a loose thread on her sleeve. She retreated into the sanctuary of her mind, to the memory of her mother Salira's smile, her father Atheron's hand on her shoulder. It was a small, fragile world, but it was hers. The bidding started low. A farmer offered a handful of copper. A brothel owner raised it to a silver piece. Each bid was a fresh humiliation, a new nail hammered into the coffin of her old life. She was no longer Lysandra of the Sunstone lineage. She was just number 17. A hush fell over the crowd, a sudden sharp intake of collective breath. The air grew cold, charged with a palpable sense of dread. From the edge of the square, a figure emerged, parting the throng of lesser men like a great ship cleaving through water. He was tall, impossibly so, wrapped in furs as dark as a starless night. His hair was the color of polished obsidian, and his eyes were chips of winter ice, whispers spread like wildfire. King Corvath, the Wolf King of the Obsidian Peaks. A ruler whose name was used to frighten children, a man said to have a heart of stone and a temper of fire. His kingdom was a brutal, unforgiving land of snow and shadow, a place where strength was the only currency that mattered. Weakness was a death sentence. What was he doing here, in the soft southern lands? Corvath's icy gaze swept over the auction block, dismissing the other offerings with contempt. Then his eyes landed on her. Lysandra felt it like a physical blow. It was not a look of lust or avarice, like the others. It was something else entirely. Something primal. A shock of recognition, sharp and fierce, that seemed to pierce the veil of her silence and see the soul cowering within. An animal instinct deep inside her, a part of her she hadn't known existed, stirred. It whispered a single, impossible word. Mine. Varric stammered, his bravado melting under that glacial stare. Your Majesty. An unexpected honor. Corvath ignored him. His focus was entirely on Lysandra. He took a step forward, and the crowd instinctively shrank back. The girl, he said. His voice was a low growl, the sound of rocks grinding together in the deep earth. It vibrated in Lysandra's bones. I will buy her. Drelven scurried forward, bowing so low his forehead nearly touched the dirt. Of course, Your Majesty. A fine choice. Her price is currently 3 silver pieces. Corvath reached into a pouch at his belt and tossed a small, heavy bag onto the stage. It landed with a dull, resonant thud. The leather ties burst open, spilling a river of gold coins that shimmered in the weak sunlight. It was a fortune, more than the entire auction would make in a year, more than Drelvin had ever seen in his miserable life. Gasps echoed through the square. Drelvin's eyes were wide with disbelief and avarice. "Is that enough?" Corvath's voice was laced with a dangerous sarcasm. Varric nodded dumbly, his jaw slack. The king had not just bought her. He had made a statement. He had paid a queen's ransom for a broken, mute Omega. He had saved her from the brothel owner, from the farmer, from a life of quiet misery. But what fate had he saved her for? Two of his guards, warriors clad in black steel and wolf pelts, moved to the stage. They were mountains of muscle and grim silence. One of them reached for her arm. His touch was rough, impersonal. But before his fingers could close around her, King Corvath spoke again, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. "Do not touch her." The guard froze, snatching his hand back as if burned. The king ascended the steps to the block himself. He moved with a predatory grace that was both terrifying and mesmerizing. He stopped before her, so close she could feel the cold radiating from his body. She had to crane her neck to look up at his face. Up close, she could see the faint lines of exhaustion around his eyes, a deep, abiding weariness that his fearsome reputation did not betray. He held out a hand. It was a large hand, scarred and calloused, a warrior's hand. But the gesture was not a command. It was an invitation. Lysandra hesitated for a single, thundering heartbeat. Then, slowly, she placed her small, trembling hand into his. His skin was cold. Unnaturally, shockingly cold, like touching marble in the dead of winter. A faint tremor went through him as their skin met, a shudder so subtle she might have imagined it. He closed his fingers around hers, his grip firm but not crushing. He led her from the block, down the steps, and through the stunned, silent crowd. The sea of people parted for them, their whispers dying on their lips. Lysandra did not look back at Drelvin, who was still on his knees, scrabbling for the scattered gold. She kept her eyes on the broad, dark expanse of the king's back. She was his now. She had traded one cage for another. But as he led her toward the grim, iron-wrought carriage that awaited them, she couldn't deny the flicker of something she hadn't felt in a very long time. A sliver of impossible, terrifying hope. The journey to the Obsidian Peaks was a descent into winter's heart. Lush green farmlands gave way to sparse, hardy forests, which in turn surrendered to the jagged, snow-dusted teeth of the mountains. The air grew thin and sharp, biting at Lysandra's cheeks. She sat opposite King Corvath in the carriage, the space between them charged with a heavy, unspoken tension. He had not spoken a word to her since leaving the market. He simply watched her. His gaze was intense, analytical, as if he were trying to solve a puzzle. It was unnerving, yet she did not feel the predatory threat she had felt from the men at the auction. This was different. It was possessive. What does he want from me? The question echoed in the silent chambers of her mind. She was a mute, a broken thing. Why pay a fortune for something so flawed? She clutched the rough wool blanket he had given her tighter around her shoulders, a small comfort against the encroaching cold and the chill that emanated from the man himself. The king's fortress, when it finally came into view, was a terrifying marvel. It was not built so much as carved from the very peak of the highest mountain, a jagged crown of black stone that clawed at the gray sky. Castle Volkov, Wolf's Keep. It looked as unforgiving as its master. There were no pleasantries upon their arrival. Guards in dark armor bowed their heads as Corvath swept past, their faces grim and disciplined. The vast halls were fashioned from the same black stone, lit by sputtering torches that cast long, dancing shadows. The air was frigid, and silence seemed to be the native tongue of this place. It was a kingdom built on strength, ruled by fear. And she was the embodiment of weakness. Corvath led her not to the dungeons or the servants' quarters, but up a winding staircase to the royal wing. He stopped before a heavy oak door and pushed it open. "This will be your room," he stated, his voice echoing slightly in the corridor. Lysandra stepped inside, her breath catching in her throat. It was a chamber of stark luxury. A large bed was piled high with dark furs. A massive stone hearth dominated one wall with a low fire already crackling within, and a set of arched windows offered a dizzying view of the snow-swept peaks beyond. It was a room for a lady, not a slave. "You will be my personal attendant," he continued, his voice devoid of emotion. "You will answer to no one but me." He took a step closer, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop. "They told me you are mute. Is this true?" Lysandra met his gaze and gave a single slow nod. His eyes narrowed slightly. "Can you write?" Another nod. He seemed satisfied by this, though his expression remained a mask of cold authority. "Food and clothing will be brought to you. Do not leave this room until I summon you." With that, he turned and left, the heavy door closing behind him with a sound of finality. Lysandra was left alone in the opulent cage. She walked to the window, pressing her hand against the cold glass. The world outside was a vista of white and black, beautiful and brutal. She was a prisoner here, no matter how gilded the bars. Her new life began in silence and confusion. Days were spent in the king's shadow. She organized his study, a chaotic mess of maps and military strategy scrolls. She served his meals in his private dining chamber, a somber affair he always took alone. She stood by silently during his council meetings, a ghost in the corner of the throne room as his generals and advisors debated matters of war and state. The court was a nest of vipers. Warriors sized her up with suspicion. Servants whispered behind their hands, their words like poisoned darts. They could not understand why the king kept a useless mute so close. One woman in particular watched her with open hostility. Her name was Zerinthia, a courtier with sharp features and eyes like obsidian chips. She had clearly coveted the king's attention for a long time, and Lysandra's sudden, inexplicable presence was an insult she could not bear. Zerinthia missed no opportunity to make Lysandra's life difficult. She would trip her in the corridors, spill wine on the floors Lysandra had just cleaned, and mock her silence with cruel, cutting gestures. Lysandra bore it all with the same quiet endurance she had cultivated for years. Her silence was her shield. King Corvath, for his part, remained an enigma. He was a demanding master, his commands clipped and precise. Yet, small things began to stand out. One afternoon, Zerinthia cornered Lysandra in a hallway, sneering as she knocked a tray of parchments from her hands. "Useless creature," Zerinthia hissed. "I don't know what the king sees in you. You are nothing." As Lysandra knelt to gather the scattered scrolls, a shadow fell over them. "Is there a problem, Lady Zerinthia?" Corvath's voice was dangerously soft. Zerinthia paled, her arrogance vanishing in an instant. No, Your Majesty, I was just helping." "I see," he said, his arctic eyes fixed on Zerinthia's face. "From now on, your help will not be required anywhere near her. Am I understood?" "Yes, Your Majesty," Zerinthia whispered, before scurrying away like a frightened mouse. Corvath knelt down, his movements surprisingly fluid for such a large man. He helped her gather the last of the parchments, his cold fingers brushing against hers. The touch sent a jolt through her, a strange mix of ice and fire. He said nothing more, simply handed her the scrolls and walked away, leaving her with a racing heart. It was an act of unexpected protection, a small kindness in a world of cruelty. Another time, he found her in the castle's small, neglected aviary, tending to a raven with a broken wing. She had fashioned a tiny splint from twigs and a strip of her own tunic. He watched her for a long time from the doorway, his expression unreadable. She had felt his presence, but did not stop her gentle work. Later that evening, Othric, the royal physician, appeared at her door with proper medical supplies for the bird, stating he was there on the king's orders. These moments were pebbles dropped into the still pool of her resignation, sending ripples of confusion and a strange, burgeoning warmth through her. The true mystery of the king, however, was his chill. It was more than just a cold demeanor. His skin was always cold to the touch. The air around him was perpetually cooler than the rest of the room. She saw the way he sometimes flinched from contact, the way he wore gloves even within the heated castle walls. One night, a blizzard raged outside, rattling the windows of the keep. Lysandra was stoking the fire in his study while he worked late at his desk. A log shifted, sending a shower of hot embers onto the stone hearth. One stray spark landed on a pile of papers near his hand. Before she could even think, Lysandra lunged forward, slapping her hand over the smoldering parchment to extinguish the ember. A sharp pain seared her palm. She bit back a cry, cradling her burned hand. Corvath was on his feet in an instant. He crossed the room in 2 long strides, his face a mask of concern. "Let me see," he commanded, his voice rough. He reached for her hand. She instinctively pulled back, not from fear of him, but from the memory of his icy touch. Pain on top of cold seemed a terrible combination. "Let me see," he repeated, softer this time. Reluctantly, she extended her hand. He took it gently, turning it over to inspect the angry red mark on her palm. His touch was as cold as ever. But something strange happened. The cold was not painful. It was soothing. It leached the fire from her skin, a balm against the burn. The relief was so immediate, so profound, that a small sigh escaped her lips. Corvath froze. He stared down at their joined hands, his expression one of utter shock. He looked from her hand to her face, his icy blue eyes wide with a dawning, incredulous light. "The pain, it is lessened?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Lysandra nodded, her own eyes wide with confusion. He slowly ran his thumb over her palm, and where his skin touched hers, the throbbing ache vanished completely. A warmth, faint but undeniable, began to bloom in his own skin, a current flowing from her into him. He looked astonished and vulnerable. For the first time since she had met him, the Wolf King's mask slipped, revealing a glimpse of the tormented man beneath. He held her hand for a moment longer than necessary, his gaze locked with hers. The air crackled with a new kind of energy, an intimacy forged in silence, and a shared, inexplicable magic. He was cursed. She did not know how or why, but she knew it with a certainty that settled deep in her bones. His coldness was a sickness, and somehow, her presence was the cure. He finally released her hand, stepping back as if he had been burned himself. The vulnerability was gone, replaced by his usual guarded expression, but the charged atmosphere remained. "There is a healing salve in my chambers," he said, his voice strained. "Fetch it." It was a dismissal, an attempt to rebuild the walls between them. But it was too late. Something had shifted. A connection had been forged in the heart of the fire, a silent understanding that transcended words. As she left the study, Lysandra knew that her fate and the fate of the cursed king were now irrevocably intertwined. The weeks that followed were a delicate, silent dance. Corvath began to seek out her presence more and more. He would summon her to his study under the pretense of needing a scroll, only to sit in silence for an hour while he worked, the quiet companionship seeming to ease the rigid set of his shoulders. He started taking his meals with her, not at the grand dining table, but on the floor by the roaring hearth in his private chambers. He would speak to her, telling her of his kingdom, of the harsh beauty of the mountains, of the loyalty of his people. He never asked her to respond. He simply talked, filling the silence she was forced to keep. Lysandra, in turn, communicated with him through small gestures, with the raising of an eyebrow or the tilt of her head. She would write notes on a small slate he provided for her, her script neat and elegant. She told him of the southern lands, of the scent of rain on summer dust, of the stories her mother used to tell. In these quiet moments, the king and the slave vanished. They were just Corvath and Lysandra. His touch, once rare, became more frequent. He would find excuses to let his fingers brush against hers as she handed him a goblet. He would rest his hand on the small of her back to guide her through a doorway. Each touch was still cold, but the unnatural chill was lessening. A faint human warmth was beginning to return to him, a miracle she was somehow performing just by being near. The inner wolf she had sensed at the auction was awake now. It recognized him. It yearned for him with a primal ache that frightened her. Her rational mind knew he was a king, a dangerous man, her owner. But her soul, her very essence, knew something else. Mate. The word was a constant humming refrain in her heart. She fought it, terrified of the implications. Her vow was a looming shadow over this fragile, growing connection. She was a ticking clock, counting down to a moment that could destroy everything. If he knew her secret, knew the magic she was sworn to protect, would he still look at her with that dawning tenderness? Or would he see her as a weapon, a prize to be used? One night the moon was full and bright, spilling like silver water over the snow-covered peaks. Corvath came to her room long after the castle had fallen silent. "Come with me," he said, his voice low. He led her through secret passages and down winding stairs to a part of the castle she had never seen. He pushed open a small hidden door, and they stepped out into the biting night air. They were in a grotto, a small sheltered cove carved into the mountainside. A natural hot spring bubbled in the center, sending plumes of steam into the frosty air. The moonlight illuminated the space, making the ice crystals on the rock walls glitter like 1,000 diamonds. It was beautiful. A secret, magical place. "This is the heart of the mountain," Corvath said, his breath misting in front of him. "My mother Araveth used to bring me here." It was the first time he had ever mentioned his family. The confession was an offering, a piece of his guarded heart laid bare for her. He turned to face her, his silver eyes luminous in the moonlight. The cold mask of the king was completely gone. In its place was a man, raw and vulnerable. "Lysandra," he began, his voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name. "Before you came, my life was a frozen hell. I am cursed, a shadow affliction placed on me by an enemy years ago. It drains my life, my warmth. The touch of another was agony, until you." He took her hands in his. They were cool, but no longer icy. "When you are near, the curse recedes. When you touch me, I feel whole. I feel alive." He lifted one of her hands and pressed it against his chest. over his heart. She could feel the steady, strong beat beneath her palm. "My soul knew you the moment I saw you on that block," he whispered, his voice cracking. "My wolf recognized its mate." The words she had been so afraid of were now spoken aloud, hanging in the steam-filled air between them. Mate. Tears pricked at Lysandra's eyes. Her own heart ached with the truth of it. Yes, yes, he was hers, and she was his. "I am asking you to accept this bond," he pleaded, his gaze searching hers, desperate for a sign. "I don't know why you are silent, what terrible thing was done to you to steal your voice, but I don't care. Your silence is more eloquent than any words." He leaned in closer, his forehead resting against hers. "But I need to know. I need a sign. Say my name, Lysandra. Just once. Whisper it. Let me hear my name in your voice, and I will know. I will know that you feel it too." Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through the warm bubble of the moment. Her vow. The sunstone shall remain hidden, its guardian silent, until the moon of the winter solstice weeps tears of blood upon the peak. The words of the prophecy were seared into her memory. The solstice was still months away. To speak now, to break the vow, it would mean forfeiting her family's legacy. The sunstone, the ancient artifact that held the power of light and life, would lose its magic forever. It would be a betrayal of her dead parents, of her entire bloodline. She couldn't. She looked into his pleading eyes, and her heart shattered into a million pieces. How could she make him understand? How could she explain the impossible choice she faced? Love for him, or duty to her ancestors? Tears streamed down her face, hot against her cold skin. She shook her head, a small, violent gesture of denial. Corvath's face fell. The hope in his eyes died, extinguished like a candle in the wind. You don't feel it?" he whispered, his voice hollow with disbelief, and a pain so profound it stole her breath. She shook her head again, more desperately this time, trying to convey that it wasn't true, that she did feel it, that she couldn't explain. But he didn't understand. He saw only her rejection. She reached out, wanting to touch his face, to comfort him, but he flinched away from her. The unnatural chill returned to his skin with a vengeance. The air around them grew frigid. "I see," he said, his voice flat and dead. He straightened up, and the walls slammed back into place around his heart. The king was back, colder and more remote than ever before. "I was mistaken," he said, his tone clipped and formal. "Forgive my presumption." He turned his back on her, a gesture of absolute dismissal. "The guard will escort you back to the servants' quarters. You will be reassigned to the kitchens in the morning." The words were like stones, each one striking her with brutal force. Servants' quarters, the kitchens. He was casting her out, away from his side, away from his life. He was punishing her for a rejection she never wanted to make. She wanted to scream, to cry out, to tell him everything. But the magical vow was a chain on her tongue. She could only stand there, silent and broken, as the man her soul claimed as its mate walked away, leaving her alone in the cold, beautiful grotto that had, for a fleeting moment, felt like paradise. The great misunderstanding was complete. And in the shadows, a different kind of evil, one that had been watching and waiting, prepared to make its move. Life in the kitchens was a circle of hell. The heat was oppressive, the work was back-breaking, and the other servants, emboldened by her fall from grace, treated her with open contempt. Zorinthia, in particular, took great pleasure in her demotion. She would sweep through the kitchens, her fine silks trailing on the greasy floor to issue impossible orders and mock Lysandra's silence. "Scrubbing pot suits you, mute," she would sneer. "It's what you were born for." Lysandra bore the torment with a numb resignation. The physical hardship was nothing compared to the agony in her heart. She was sundered from Corvath. The bond between them, now denied, was a raw, gaping wound. She could feel his pain as if it were her own, a constant, chilling ache that settled deep in her bones. She caught glimpses of him sometimes in the halls or across the courtyard. He looked worse than ever. The curse was consuming him at an accelerated rate. His skin was pale, his movements stiff, and the shadows under his eyes were dark and deep. He never looked at her. He looked through her, as if she were a ghost. The court whispered that the king was unwell, that a strange malady had taken hold of him. His temper grew short, his judgments harsh. The warmth that had begun to seep into Castle Volkov vanished, replaced by an even deeper, more oppressive chill. Lord Mortavius, the king's cousin and chief advisor, seemed to be the only one who thrived in the new, grim atmosphere. He was a man with a serpent's smile and eyes that held no light. He was constantly at Corvath's side, his voice a low, soothing murmur in the king's ear. Lysandra watched him from the shadows, a deep sense of unease coiling in her gut. Mortavius was always watching her too, his gaze filled with a triumphant malice. He knew. Somehow he knew he was the architect of her and Corvath's misery. The rift between the king and his silent attendant was the opportunity Mortavius had been waiting for. He began to subtly poison Corvath's mind, not with potions, but with words. He spoke of spies from the southern lands, of witches who could steal a man's vitality with a touch, of silent assassins who hid behind pretty faces. Corvath, weakened by his curse and heartbroken by what he saw as Lysandra's rejection, was fertile ground for the seeds of paranoia. The final act began one evening when the king collapsed during a council meeting. He did not faint, but a violent tremor racked his body, and frost spiderwebbed across the stone floor from where his hand touched it. Panic erupted in the throne room. Mortavius was the first to his side, his face a perfect mask of concern. He helped the weakened king to his feet, hissing at Othric, the royal physician. "This is no normal illness. This is dark magic." He turned his venomous gaze on the assembled court. "The king has been growing weaker for weeks, ever since she came here." He didn't need to say her name. Every eye turned to the back of the hall, where Lysandra was delivering a tray of water. She froze, the tray rattling in her hands. Zorinthia stepped forward, her expression one of righteous fury. "He is right. I have seen her. She performs strange rituals in her room. She collects herbs and whispers to birds. She is a witch." It was a lie, a twisted version of Lysandra tending to the raven, but in the fear-charged room, it was enough. "She has never spoken a word," Mortavius continued, his voice ringing with false authority. What better way for a sorceress to hide her incantations than to feign muteness? She has been draining the king's life force, growing stronger as he fades. Corvath, leaning heavily on his cousin, looked towards Lysandra. His eyes were clouded with pain, confusion, and the poison of Mortavius's words. He saw the girl who had rejected him, the source of his renewed agony. He saw a stranger, an enemy. "Is this true?" he rasped, his voice a ghost of its former power. Lysandra shook her head frantically, her eyes pleading with him. "Number. No, I would never hurt you." But her silence was her condemnation. "Seize the witch," Mortavius commanded the guards, a triumphant smirk playing on his lips. The guards hesitated, looking to their king for confirmation. Corvath looked at Lysandra, his face a battleground of doubt and betrayal. He gave a slow, pained nod. That single gesture broke what was left of her heart. The guards grabbed her, their gauntlets rough on her arms. She did not struggle. She was dragged from the throne room, down to the deepest, coldest dungeon in the keep. The heavy iron door slammed shut, plunging her into absolute darkness. The charges were treason and witchcraft. There was no trial. Her sentence was proclaimed the next day. She was to be purified by shadow fire at a public ceremony on the night of the new moon. It was a spectacle, a warning to any who would dare to harm the king. But Lysandra knew the truth. It was a ritual. Mortavius, a practitioner of the forbidden shadow arts, was using her as a focus. The ceremony was designed to sever the final thread of Corvath's life force, allowing Mortavius to absorb his power and claim the throne. She was not just sentenced to death. She was to be the instrument of her mate's murder. The dungeon was a place where hope went to die. The cold was absolute, seeping into her bones until she thought she would never be warm again. Time became a meaningless concept, measured only by the meager bowl of gruel and cup of water slid through a slot in the door once a day. Lysandra huddled in the corner, wrapped in her own arms, lost in a sea of despair. She had failed. She had failed her parents, her vow, and the man she loved. Her silence, meant to be a shield, had become a weapon turned against her. She thought of Corvath, picturing his face as he condemned her. The confusion, the betrayal. He believed she was his enemy. This pain was worse than any execution. As the day of the ceremony drew near, a strange calm settled over her. She had nothing left to lose, but she would not be Mortavius's pawn. She would not be the vessel for Corvath's death. She ran her fingers over the rough stone walls, her mind racing. The prophecy, until the moon of the winter solstice weeps tears of blood upon the peak. The winter solstice. It was still weeks away. Her vow was unbreakable until then. Or was it? Her mother Salira's lessons on magic, whispered in the dead of night long ago, came back to her. A vow sealed in blood could be altered by a greater sacrifice, a life for a life. If she could not speak to save him, perhaps she could use the magic of her bloodline in another way. The Sunstone's power was a power of light, of life. It was the antithesis of Mortavius's shadow magic. Even without the stone itself, the magic lived in her blood. A desperate, terrifying plan began to form in her mind. It was a suicidal gamble, but it was the only move she had left. The day of the execution dawned gray and grim. The guards who came for her were not the usual dungeon keepers. They were Mortavius's men, their armor adorned with a shadow wolf insignia. They dragged her from the cell, up the winding stairs, and into the main courtyard of the castle. A pyre had been constructed in the center, a grim stack of dark, oil-soaked wood. The entire court was assembled, their faces a mixture of fear, morbid curiosity, and satisfaction. Zerinthia stood near the front, her expression one of pure triumph. Corvath was there, seated on a temporary throne. He looked like a ghost. His skin was the color of ash, his breathing shallow. He was a puppet, his strings pulled by the man who stood beside him, Mortavius. He was dressed in dark ceremonial robes, his face alight with a feverish, manic energy. He was savoring his victory. Lysandra was chained to a post in the center of the pyre. The cold iron bit into her wrists. She scanned the sky. The new moon was a faint, invisible sliver, but something else was happening. Strange crimson clouds were gathering over the highest peak, the one the castle was built upon. A celestial phenomenon. A red aurora, rarely seen this far south. It looked as if the sky itself was bleeding. Weeps tears of blood upon the peak. Her heart hammered against her ribs. It wasn't the solstice, it was tonight. The prophecy was not about a specific date, it was about this sign. Her vow was fulfilled. The lock on her voice crumbled to dust. Mortavius raised his hands, his voice booming across the silent courtyard. Let the purification begin. Let this darkness be purged from our kingdom, and our king restored. He began to chant in a guttural, ancient tongue. Black, oily smoke began to rise from the unlit pyre, coalescing around Lysandra. It was shadow magic, cold and life-draining. She could feel it trying to latch onto her, to use her as a conduit to Corvath. She looked at Corvath. His head was bowed, his body trembling with the effort of just sitting upright. His life was moments from being snuffed out. This was it. The time had come. Lysandra took a deep breath, the frigid air stinging her lungs. She opened her mouth, a mouth that had not formed a word in years, and she spoke. Her voice was not a whisper. It was a cry of pure, unadulterated power. Corvath! The sound ripped through the courtyard. It was not just a name. It was a command. It was a claiming. It was filled with all the love, the yearning, the desperation she had kept locked inside. The sound of it, clear and resonant, shattered Mortavius's chant. The black smoke recoiled as if struck. Every head snapped towards her. Disbelief, shock, fear. Corvath's head shot up. His eyes, though clouded with magic, widened. He heard her. Through the fog of the curse, through the poison of Mortavius's lies, her voice reached him. It was a beacon in his personal darkness. Mortavius is the traitor, she shouted, her voice growing stronger with every word. He is the one who cursed you. He is using the ceremony to kill you. Mortavius's face contorted with rage. Silence the witch! He roared at his guards. But it was too late. Doubt had been planted. Belthar, Corvath's loyal beta, drew his sword, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. Lysandra focused all her will, all the magic of her bloodline that was now unbound. She spoke the words of the old tongue, the language of light her mother had taught her. It was a song of creation, of life, of the sun's warmth. A brilliant golden light erupted from her, a miniature sun in the heart of the courtyard. It vaporized the shadow magic. It shattered the iron chains on her wrists. The light washed over Corvath, and he cried out, not in pain, but in release. The fog in his eyes cleared. The ashen color of his skin was replaced by a healthy flush. He surged to his feet, his full power, his full alpha strength, returning in a tidal wave. He looked at Mortavius, and his eyes were chips of ice, burning with a righteous fury. He saw the truth. He saw his cousin's betrayal in its entirety. He saw Lysandra, standing in a halo of golden light, her face streaked with tears, her eyes blazing with love and defiance. His mate, his savior. Traitor, Corvath growled, his voice the thunder of an avalanche. Mortavius, his plan in ruins, shrieked in fury and desperation. He drew a wicked-looking dagger, its blade coated in shadows, and lunged not at Corvath, but at Lysandra. If he could not have the throne, he would destroy the source of his failure. But Corvath was faster. He moved like a blur, a predator unleashed. He intercepted Mortavius, his arm catching the dagger strike. The clash of steel and a guttural roar filled the air. Belthar and the loyal guards engaged Mortavius's men, the courtyard erupting into a flurry of controlled, deadly combat. Lysandra did not hesitate. She ran to Corvath. He had disarmed Mortavius and now held his cousin in an iron grip. "The secret," she said, her voice urgent as she placed her hand on his chest. "My family were the guardians of the Sunstone. My vow of silence protected its location. The magic lives in my blood." She poured her light, her power, into him. It was a torrent of warmth and healing, flushing out the last vestiges of the shadow curse from his soul. This was the true claiming. Not a word, but an act of mutual salvation. He gasped, his body arching as her magic healed the years of damage. He was whole. He was free. He looked down at her, his eyes filled with a universe of gratitude, regret, and overwhelming love. "Lysandra," he breathed, his voice thick with emotion. The fighting was over. Mortavius and his conspirators were subdued, disarmed, and bound. The courtyard was silent once more, save for the panting of the warriors. Corvath ignored them all. He had eyes only for her. He cupped her face in his hands, his touch now filled with a vibrant, living warmth. "Forgive me," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I was a fool. I was blind." "You were cursed," she whispered back, her hands covering his. And then, in front of his entire court, the fearsome wolf king of the Obsidian Peaks lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion, but of reverence. It was a promise, a new beginning. The sun, which had been hidden behind the clouds all day, broke through, bathing the courtyard in its light, a perfect echo of the magic that had saved them all. 1 year later, the great hall of Castle Volkov was unrecognizable. The grim black stone was now adorned with rich tapestries of gold and crimson. Sunlight streamed through the high-arched windows, no longer fighting against the shadows but dancing in the vast space. The air was filled not with silence and fear, but with music and laughter. King Corvath stood on the dais, his hand clasped firmly in that of his wife, Queen Lysandra. He was no longer the cold, remote ruler. The curse was gone, and in its place was a warmth that radiated through his entire kingdom. He smiled down at her, a genuine, open smile that transformed his harsh features into something handsome and noble. Lysandra smiled back, her heart full to bursting. She wore a gown of white silk embroidered with golden thread, a small polished sunstone resting in the hollow of her throat. Her voice, once her prison, was now one of her greatest assets. She ruled alongside her husband with a compassion and wisdom that had tempered the harshness of his people. The Obsidian Peaks were no longer just a kingdom of strength. They were a kingdom of justice and honor. The transformation had been profound. Lord Mortavius was imprisoned in the same dungeon he had thrown her into, his shadow magic neutralized forever. Zorinthia had been exiled, sent back to her family in disgrace. The rest of the court had quickly and eagerly adapted to the new, warmer reign of their king and his Sunstone Queen. The celebration today marked the first anniversary of Mortavius's defeat and their union. It was a festival of light, a testament to the love that had healed a nation. Later that evening, after the feasts and the dancing, Corvath led her by the hand to the moonlit grotto. The hot spring steamed gently in the cool night air, the ice crystals on the walls still glittering like diamonds. It was no longer a place of painful rejection, but of sacred promises. "A year ago," Corvath said, his voice a low, intimate rumble, "I stood in this spot a broken man. I asked you for a word, and you gave me silence." He turned to face her, lifting her hand to his lips and kissing her knuckles. "I didn't understand then. I didn't know that your silence was a greater act of love than any word could ever be. You were protecting us all. "And you," she replied, her voice soft. "Heard me when it mattered most. You heard my heart, even when my lips were sealed." He pulled her close, wrapping his strong arms around her. His embrace was warm, safe. It was home. "I will spend the rest of my life making up for my blindness," he vowed, his lips brushing against her hair. "There is nothing to forgive," she whispered, tilting her head back to look at him. "We saved each other." He looked down at her, his love for her a tangible thing in his gaze. "My brave, silent mate," he murmured, before lowering his head to kiss her. The kiss was deep and passionate, a testament to the storms they had weathered and the peace they had found. Their bond, once a source of pain and misunderstanding, was now the bedrock of a new era. The cursed king and his hidden gem had found their salvation in each other, and in doing so, had brought the dawn to a kingdom that had lived too long in the shadows. Their love was a song, and their kingdom was finally ready to hear the music. And in the quiet moments, when the world was asleep, he would still ask her to whisper his name. A beautiful reminder of the voice that had called him back from the brink and given him a reason to live, to love, and to be whole. Theirs was a story that would be told for generations, a legend of a silent vow and the king who learned to listen with his heart.